Let me begin my presentation by giving you first some sense of where I am coming from and some of the thinkers and others. We're always standing on the shoulders, as the cliche says, on other giants who have come before us, who have affected the way I have been studying Somali society for the past 25 years. And I think our conclusions in the end will be different, I think. Let me first suggest at least 4 people who have affected me, and I think in one way or another work behind me in the sense that I am going to present what I have here as briefly as I can. The first person I want to bring to the presentation before I go on to actually tell you what I want to do is a French historian by the name of Fernand Braudel. Braudel talks about the concept of time, and suggests that time is not only one kind, but at least time is, in his opinion, and I agree with him, is of 3 kinds. 3 kinds of time. And any time, therefore, you do analysis, even if you are not aware of it, you are usually tripping in these 3 kinds of time. The one kind of time, Braudel says, is the event. The event. This is an event. It starts at 12 o'clock. It might end up at 2 or maybe 2:30, we don't know. But this is an event. Highly compressed incidents and moment. And he suggests that that is very alluring, very attractive to men and women and people, because we live in the moment itself. And it is so easily accessible to us. But he said it's very dangerous and it's very misleading in the sense that it is like a foam that appears rather brilliantly and then disappears rather quickly, or a firefly or something like that. So he warns against that. And partly because also our own mentality and ego and everything is wrapped up in the event in which we are actually functioning within. The second kind of time that Braudel talks about is what he calls the conjuncture, and that is a cluster of events that come together which give a certain density and a degree of durability to that particular kind of time. So it could be anywhere between 5 years or 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, maybe even as long as 50 years. So for example, if you take the Great Depression, well, the Great Depression had events. So you have the day the stock market crashed. We can pinpoint that day. But the Great Depression also dragged for at least a decade, maybe even 2 decades, in terms of its effect. Braudel therefore suggests that conjunctures, that's to say the confluence of a number of events, which create then a kind of a heavy block of time with a greater density and therefore slower speed, is very important for him to understand. And he thinks that is one of the places where comprehension of the mysteries of life, as we try to explore them, are located rather than just the event, even though the event is the beginning itself. And then the third kind of time that Braudel suggests is what he calls the longue durée, the long duration. And that is time that is almost imperceptible. It is so deep and it's so slow that we hardly have any sense of it. But for him, this is where the structures of life are located, like institutions of life. Because they are so durable that some of them, in fact, could very well easily be millennia. Civilizations, for example. These millennia, maybe even more. These are repetitive, durable, almost imperceptible, extremely slow structures of life. And for him, that, in fact, where most of the great questions are located is in the deep time. So that's one. And therefore, as I speak, I might be going between an event, conjuncture, and then deep time, and then back and forth, and therefore mix them as I see them fit. The second person that I want to bring to appear with me is a German philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant raises, from my point of view, 3 important questions that are relevant to this discussion. Because Somalia is not some little thing over there. It is part of, of the happenings of human history. And Kant asks the first question he asks, which I think we ought to ask, is, what can I know? What can I know, given the topic of Somalia today? Second question is, what ought I to do? Recommendations, or at least the suggestions that my colleague has put forth, speak to that. And then the third question that Kant asks is, for what may I hope for? And I think all of those three questions, from my point of view, are pertinent to a discussion about the Somali society. The third person I want to bring is an Italian thinker by the name of Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci is a heavy-duty activist of the 20th century, flew in the face of Mussolini, and in the end, in fact, was destroyed by Mussolini, and he died in hospital in Italy. But he was in prison for a long time, and while he was in prison, he wrote lots of notes, which are now called the prison notes. And Gramsci left many important insights, but one thing I like about him that is pertinent today is a line that is very famous, and that is, he says, when he's talking to activists and others and students and professors and people in life generally, he says, it's important to have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. In other words, make sure that you are skeptical about the ideas and the world in which you are thinking about, but when the moment comes for you to act, do the best you can and give your best to the circumstances that you want to do about it. Yeah? Pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And then the final and the fourth question I want to call is a Somali poet. A poet, perhaps the greatest Somali poet of the 20th century. At least he will be one of the two. If you argue Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, the early 20th century as part of that, he will be, I think, in that range. But in my opinion, certainly the greatest poet of the 20th century, and so relevant to what we are talking about today, even though he died in 1973. And many of the things that we are confronted today, he spoke about them very clearly and warned the Somalis that, in fact, if they do not begin to think differently, behave differently, and act differently, the circumstances that they will confront would be quite catastrophic. And his name was Abdullahi Sultan Tumat. And if he was alive and sitting here today, he would have told us many, many times, I told you so, I told you so, I told you so. But there is a line from his very many poems in which I think for me is appropriate here. And the translations are never quite as good, no matter how competent you are, and I'm not very competent in translating, to the original language. But here is what he says. It's a part of a long line. Lama helo wadaado waxaan cidi ku hawshoone. Lama helo wadaado waxaan cidi ku hawshoone. Nafta loo hantaaqa waxay hiigsa leedahay. Hareeraha ragga inaga xiga amba dadka inaga xiga helo libtoodii. In other words, Saeed perhaps can translate this better than I can, but lama helo wadaado waxaan cidi ku hawshoone. He's talking not just to a particular person, a priest, but he's suggesting for those people who think they are of the book, they have the Quran in their hands. The Quran doesn't give you the key to what you need to do in this life. In fact, you have to work for it and sweat for it, which means to a certain extent you have to put the Quran on the side and go on to work. And if you want to build a world, he says, you have to push yourself again and again and again. For those, the communities around us, whether it's the Ethiopians or the Kenyans or the Eritreans or the Djiboutians and further afield, he says, this is early in the 1960s, he says, that they have already left us. We're already behind, he says. This is mid-1960 when he's talking about these things. So these are the four people that are the ghosts on whose kind of energy that I want to write today. Let me move on then quickly to talk about the topic and suggest, first of all, some basic indicators of the way I define at least the problem. And these indicators only few of them, but there are many, many. If you bring them together, then they give you a sense of where you move from. They are almost kind of a diagnostic items. And then I want to offer you a thesis of where I think the problem, deep problems lie. And then perhaps they conclude by saying a few things about the neighboring countries and the United States, since these are the major actors in the international system insofar as the Somalis are concerned, and then conclude. I agree with my colleague some of the things that he has articulated. But let me just suggest a few indicators. This is before the drought, before the famine. The famine is the last manifestation of something that has gone so wrong in Somali society for so long. Manifestation number one, indicator, hunger and destitution. Before this drought, before this famine, anywhere between 40 to 45% of the Somali people were already designated as malnourished and primarily surviving on food aid. This is before the drought, 40 to 45%. And most of these are children and women. Currently now, over 30,000 have already died, children under the age of 5. Now, in terms of, to continue this, human development reports, which usually measure the quality of life in the world among countries. Somalia scores some of the lowest in the world. In life expectancy, for example, barely 45 years before the famine and the drought. This is all before. Under 5 mortality rate per 1,000, 225, one of the highest. Clean water availability between 23 and 25% before the drought. Fertility rate, the only place where the Somalis score so high. Perhaps, I think it's the 3rd highest in the world. Literacy, maybe if you are generous, 15, 20%, but I think I would argue, in fact, it's less than that. Violence, and particularly measured in terms of child soldiers, both on the part of Al-Shabaab, but also on the part of the transitional government, transitional federal government. Child soldiers, as young as 9 years old and 10 years old. Corruption. Transparency International has given us very clearly this in monitoring these things. And corruption may be, at least in terms of Transparency International, the most corrupt country in the world, even worse than Afghanistan. And if you talk to the Somalis, as I have done in the region in this past December, what you will find is that the Somalis have got 2 kinds now of describing corruption, of 2 kinds. Yeah, Somalis can be quite insightful when they are at their best. And they suggest corruption, the normal, kind of a usual one, that people take bribes. You are speeding, the policeman stops you, and you put $2 in his pocket, and then her pocket, and then they give you a wink, and then you give. They assume that that is normal, whether you are in the Philippines or in Somalia, or maybe even in certain parts of the United States. But the one they are more concerned, the Somalis, is what they call predatory corruption. And that is literally, as some of them have described to me when I was in the Horn in December, taking food out of the mouth of the starving. That is the corruption that is quite virulent as far as the Somalis are concerned. And when they talk about this, they almost go back to language that comes from the beginning of the 20th century, in a time when some of the greatest droughts have taken place in the Horn of Africa among the Somalis. Harama'un, the time in which people ate filth. That kind of a corruption. Piracy, something that my colleague maybe was not interested in talking about and maybe didn't have time to talk about. But piracy that comes in a variety of forms. But it's a lawlessness in the international high seas that's increasingly becoming a problem both for the Somali people, but also for the rest of the world, including neighboring countries. We are now beginning to find some evidence. It is initial evidence, so I'm not quite sure whether it is still quite concrete. But pedophilia now is becoming quite visible in certain parts of the coastal parts of the Horn of Africa. To the extent that some reporters, particularly English, British newspaper reporters, are now beginning to suggest that they have some evidence that pedophilia and feeding on young Somali men and women particularly women, is becoming some problem in the coastal regions of Somalia. People coming from other parts of the world, therefore doing these kinds of things to young Somali people. Another feature of the Somali catastrophe crisis is regional secession. There is hardly any Somalia anymore, folks. I mean, the name exists, but there's hardly any Somalia now, except as a geographical entity. The transitional federal government has no capacity beyond Mogadishu, and not even the whole of Mogadishu. Okay? I'll talk about that in a minute. But the country is fragmenting, and it is going in different directions. In fact, some regions of the country have long ago decided that they are going to be out of Somali society, and they are going to become an independent country called Somaliland, and they have nothing to do with the rest of the country. They have made that case. I mean, I'm one of those people. I'm a unionist, and I find that quite frightening, but it is a fact, and others are moving in that direction. So much so that, in fact, the other day, for those of you who might not know, when the UN was in session, the current Prime Minister of the TFG and the Speaker of the House of the Parliament were both here in Washington, D.C. And they came on two different delegations, staying in the same hotel, not dealing with each other. One is in the 4th floor or the 5th floor, the other one is the 2nd floor. You see, not dealing with each other. One came, the Speaker of the House, so that he can campaign for the creation of a new state within the state in central Somalia, the Baydhabo kind of a state, grounded on some kind of a clan identity. The Prime Minister ostensibly has come for some national project, whatever that was. And they had nothing to do with each other. They would say hello to each other, but they were going different places, like they were representing two different countries. And this perversion of Islamic values comes in a variety of forms. But in the end, what it becomes is the crumbling of moral foundations of the Somali society. Denial of basic aesthetic joy among the Somalis, imposition through threat of violence or other kinds of intimidations, of alien interpretations of Islam that comes from non-Islamic sources, particularly from the Arab world. You see. In fact, I would argue that the Somalis increasingly have been pushed, and this transitional government, federal government, is particularly responsible for this. I have the Constitution right there on my desk. And if you read some of the things that are in that Constitution, you will be appalled. The Somali people now being described as an Arab people, as part of the Arab nation. My argument is that we are Africans. We're not Arabs. Yeah, we're Muslims, but we're not Arabs. Yeah. But these are part of the problems that are happening. So it is not just the international system of the West or the regional African countries. The problem is also with the Arab world, who are now increasingly creating a kind of a neo-colonial project for the Somalis. The final point I want to make before I get to the thesis is that international society, particularly in the West and the African countries, the reaction now is at three kinds. I can't unpack them, but three. One, aghast. Oh, the Somalis, oh God. Oh, it's just aghast. The people are just tired of Somalis and their problems. You find that all over the place. The president of Uganda bluntly said to the international community that the Somalis are the shame of Africa, end of quote. That's just one example. You go to Washington, you go to Brussels. I was in Brussels a month and a half ago. They wouldn't even want to talk to you. Somalis, whew. The second reaction, if it is aghast, is even worse, and that's contempt. Just contempt. That Somalis really are trash. Yeah. They're just trash. I mean, I have heard that said to me face to face. It's trash. Sometimes even worse language than that. The third is manipulation, where I would agree with my colleague, and to manipulate the Somalis so that you make them do what you want them to do, regardless of their interest. And that's done both by Africans, including the Ugandans, but also, as I said, the Arab countries and some of the countries in the powerful West. The final point I want to make in terms of these indicators is that I think the economist was right. at the end of 2009. And that is Somalia as the worst country in the world. You pick up any major indicator you want to, and I think the conclusions of the economists and this is before the drought. How do you explain that all of this becomes the question? And here's why I get to my thesis, and rather quickly. My argument has been in place for nearly 20 years. And I thought I would learn something and change that thesis. But the evidence that comes to me, the data that comes to me, just deepens that thesis and adds another layer and another layer. I wish I could say otherwise. And my basic argument, therefore, is this, that the Somali condition can best be described and characterized as a catastrophe. Catastrophe technically defined as the confluence of a number of crises. As a catastrophe. It's not like the Mississippi River. So many different other tributaries come to create the great Mississippi River. It's not just one. If you go to the beginning of where the Mississippi starts, you will never think that the great Mississippi starts over here, up there in Minnesota. But it's all of these other rivers that make it until it floods into Louisiana and the Delta area. Now, this catastrophe, therefore, has created a hellgate, both for the Somali people, but also the bewilderment of the international community, and particularly Somali friends. I identify, therefore, these crises that have come together to create a catastrophe. And unless those are understood, I don't think the Somalis can ever really begin a new history to change things. The number one crisis, the most difficult in many ways, and the hidden one, the deep one, the Brudelian kind of a one. That's what I call the destruction of telos. T-E-L-O-S, for those who might not know that word. Telos, I mean that by the collapse and the loss of concepts that gave the Somali people, some in their lives, some meaning of collective life. Those have collapsed. They have collapsed, and that's part of the reason why you have seen the fragmentation at the personal and also at the community level. Such concepts of generosity, order, justice, kindness, truth, all of these things that connect a community to become a society, and animate, therefore, and give them a rhythm of civic life. For all practical purposes, those are gone. And unless Somalis understand that, and then they go about the business of reconstructing a new telos, no amount of aid is going to really rebuild Somali society. It might save some lives, but I don't think it will rebuild the civic heart that needs to be rebuilt. The great British philosopher R.G. Collingwood called these constellations of absolute presuppositions. Unless you have those, even in a place like this Carlton College, if you dig deep enough, this is not just individual students and professors coming together and some administrators do something with each other for the day. There's some deeper sense of this place and what it stands for that connects people together and makes the alumni 25, 30, 40, 50, 60 years later to remember what the place was like and to continue to pour resources into the place. So it's not just at the level of national society, it happens at the level of colleges. The second crisis is the crisis of institutions. And institutions, national institutions, they are the cluster of macro structures that actually give the basic telos I talked about some immediate concreteness in institutions. And there is nothing more conspicuous in that context than the national state. If you don't have a national state in the era of modernity, you're going to be in trouble because it's going to be very difficult for one to put into place, in a real sense of concrete institutions, the basic foundations of a collective civic life. And in the case of the Somali people, the civic state, the national state, is normal. And what you see in Mogadishu, the transitional federal government, is a shell, empty shell, literally an empty shell. The bonds of imagined community can only be given real life by national institutions like the state. And the state, therefore, as the condensation of public life. where authority and order are located, and therefore the vagaries of life, communal life, are dealt with as competently as possible, both in terms of internal issues, but also in external defense. Today we know that the Kenyans have moved into southern Somalia. If there was a national state, this would not be taking place. Yeah. There's no national state, so the Kenyans can walk in when they want to, and they can walk back when they want to, much like the Ethiopians. There might be some people in the community who will take arms to support, but there is no national state to defend the Somali people. The third crisis that makes this a horrible catastrophe is the crisis of leadership that my colleague also talked about. Shameful bankruptcy of leadership. And I agree with him, leadership happens in many different places, but it's not all the same. Leadership at the level of the state, that's where the problems lie. The most important problems lie. And what I mean by leadership is this. First, men and women who have the competence to identify what the supreme questions of the age are. If Sharif was sitting here today, or his acolytes were sitting here today, and you ask him, as I have done, ask him, what are the problems, what are the supreme problems that confront the Somali society? I bet you he will not be able to articulate clearly. It's at that level in which the Somali leadership is bankrupt. So, identifying what the supreme questions are. There are now 25, I was told the other day, 25 individuals, every one of them musharrah, running to become president of Somalia. You ask them to articulate, they don't write anything, so you won't find it in writing. But if you ask them to articulate, at least orally, what the problems are, the great questions are, the best they can give you is, it is tribalism. It's tribalism. Kids this age will tell you that, because they hear it all the time. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the real truth. That might just be a camouflage for something much more sinister than just tribalism. I'm being warned, but I have less than a minute, so let me just conclude this. Identify the supreme questions, articulate tactics and strategies to effectively respond to these questions, and then inspire the majority to act differently than they have done before, to inspire them in a way that will lift them up so that they can have some confidence that they can steer history differently than it has been, not only the last 20 years, but certainly the last 30 years. So my friends, this epoch for the Somalis is the epoch of radical discontinuity. It's an epoch of radical discontinuity. And unless, therefore, the Somalis are able to respond to this question, then I think the problem is going to continue and get even worse. What's the final question? The final question for me then is, can Somalis, the Somali people, survive their own political death? Can they survive their own political death? It is as serious as that. And unless, therefore, they respond to that question, I'm not sure they will be able to sustain even what they have now, let alone make it better. So I'll stop here, and then maybe we can get into the discussion later on. Thank you very much.